Welcome to this Q&A mailbag episode, and a reminder to subscribe on Patreon if you want access to more content. But we got a lot of questions, so let's get right into it. So first question is from Justin Miller. Who worries you the most, Shane Bowen or Todd Downing? And then I'm also going to answer this with this other question by Brandon. After the preseason games, what do you think about the new DC, and what is your real expectation about our flaws in defense? So it's tough to really evaluate Vrabel and Bowen as coaches because we don't really know what they want this defense to look like. So Vrabel comes from the Wade Phillips, Romeo Crennel coaching tree, where you're playing a lot of too high stuff, and that's what they ran in Houston. But then when Vrabel came into Tennessee, Dean Pease is the defensive coordinator, and he's running the Baltimore, New England cover one defense with exotic blitzes. And obviously Dean Pease' scheme is going to take priority. And then Dean Pease leaves, so now we're going to get Vrabel's defense. And last year you saw them sort of start to move in that direction of playing more split safety defenses, but they were still primarily a cover one team. They ran it 37% of the time, which was 10th in the NFL. But they did start doing different things with their safeties. So in the Romeo Crennel defense, there's no free safety and strong safety. There's a left safety and a right safety. And after playing mostly free safety for his entire career, Kevin Byard started playing just left safety. So he played about 50-50 between in the box and as free safety, but he played about 75% left safety. The left-right safety system works if your safeties are interchangeable, but Vaccaro is not a guy that you want playing free safety a lot. And then they also did more two high looks pre-snap and then rolled them into single high, and there were just a ton of blown coverages in those situations. And I did notice Kevin Byard was terrible when they ran quarters coverage. So ultimately it just felt like the defensive backs were not comfortable with the scheme changes. And then you combine that with not having a pass rush, not having good personnel in the secondary, having injuries, and then not having an offseason with COVID. It was sort of the perfect storm for a bad defense. And the mindset that I've sort of come around to with Shane Bowen is that I'm willing to give last season a pass and start judging him entirely off of this season. The personnel on paper should be a top 20 defense at the very least, I would say. As for what the preseason tells me, my honest answer is nothing, because teams don't game plan for preseason games. Everyone talks about how they're all running vanilla stuff, but it's completely true. So I just don't think there's much that you can take away from a scheme perspective from preseason. And then with Todd Downing, my expectation is that his offense will be almost identical to Arthur Smith's. Obviously, he'll add his own wrinkles, but you're still going to see a ton of play action, heavy personnel, outside zone, passing concepts that attack the middle of the field. The thing with Arthur Smith is that as far as play design and sort of creating an offense, he wasn't really doing anything special. He basically just copy and pasted the stuff that Kubiak has done, Shanahan's done, McVay even, all of the West Coast offense guys. So it's the sort of thing that I think Todd Downing can just come in and pick up where Arthur Smith left off. Smith was really good as a play caller, and he had a great sense of timing and building concepts off of one another. So we'll see how Downing does in that regard, but I'm not really too worried about offensive coordinator. And then as far as the flaws on defense, the next question I'll go into more depth, but the cornerbacks are young and the pass rush is improved, but still coming off of a pretty bad year. Okay, next question from Preston asks, a review of our final roster a few days before the Arizona game would be great. Weaknesses or people to look out for. I'm also really curious to know what you focus on during the initial broadcast before analyzing the film. Okay, so I thought it would be kind of interesting to rate Tennessee's roster, and I've got my scale up top. I'm not going to go through every player, but feel free to pause the video if you're interested. So I think Ryan Tannehill falls into that category of high-end system quarterback. And I don't use system quarterback as a pejorative. I would describe Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Matt Ryan, even Baker Mayfield as system quarterbacks. They're just guys that don't really do a ton off script, but if you put a good scheme around them, they can definitely get you to a Super Bowl. Tight end was by far my biggest concern offensively until Tennessee signed Michael Pruitt, which I might have spoken into existence on Twitter, but Pruitt is the only tight end on the roster, in my opinion, who's a good blocker and a good receiver, so I expect him to play a lot of snaps this season. The O-line is definitely better in run blocking than in pass protection, but the scheme does a good job of moving the pocket and sort of minimizing the amount of true pass blocking situations that they're in. Right tackle is obviously the weak link, but between Sambrailo, Kendall Lamb, and Dylan Radins, they should be able to come up with someone who can be okay at that position. On defense, there isn't really one guy that you can lean on as a number one pass rusher, but you've got 4 guys that are perfectly capable, so I expect the defense to generate a lot more pressure, and Simmons has a really good chance of elevating his game and being that number one guy. And then cornerback is the biggest wild card because Farley and Fulton could easily outplay their rating, but it's also possible that they struggle a lot. Overall, I expect the offense to be similar caliber to the last 2 seasons, and to me, there's almost no way that the defense isn't noticeably improved. If we compare this year's lineup to last year's, the only position I would say is a downgrade is nose tackle, which is probably the least important position, and Teair Tart is a big unknown. He could easily be better than Daquan Jones. As far as what I focus on during the initial broadcast, it's not really all that different from most people, to be honest. There isn't really a ton that you can tell from the broadcast footage, and I need to have like a quota on how many times I can complain about this, but the fact that the All-22 angle is not the default football viewing experience is such a scam. I mean, imagine if basketball was shown where you couldn't even see past the three-point line, and it's like, you know, LeBron James gets the rebound. Not sure who shot that, not sure who was guarding him, but I guess we'll find out tomorrow. But yeah, so you can't see the secondary really at all from the broadcast angle, and when I watch film, I rewind each play like 15 times. But it is kind of nice because I pretty much have 2 NFL Sundays. There's the actual NFL Sunday where I can just sit back and watch football as a fan. And then whenever the All-22 comes out, I go back and watch the games more analytically, so sort of stimulates both parts of the brain. Question from Chocolate Charles Dickens. How's our running back depth and potential options on the waiver wire if King Henry were to go down? So I really liked what Mekhi Sargent showed in the preseason. I actually think he's more explosive than Darrington Evans, but with those 2 as the backups, I think they're perfectly fine. The thing about running back is there's a small handful of guys that truly elevate an offense, and Henry's obviously a part of that group, but then there's a ton of guys whose production has way more to do with their offensive line, and there's a bunch of running backs that aren't even on a roster where if you gave them good run blocking, I think they would be perfectly fine. So backup running back is just not something that I would stress about too much. The Power Hour asks, should the Titans make a run at Bernardrick McKinney for depth? So if linebacker was more of a need, I could definitely see that. Vrabel and Bowen coached him in Houston, and he has a really interesting skill set that I don't think the Titans really have with their other linebackers because he's like 6'4", 250-ish, I want to say. And he's been good in coverage. He can rush the passer, so he would be another nice chess piece for the Titans defensively. I don't know. I mean, I think, now that I think about it, I feel like that could be a really interesting move. The biggest thing with Bernardrick McKinney is that his play has definitely dropped off over the past couple seasons, but I actually wouldn't hate it for next year, though, assuming that we don't sign Rashaan Evans. Because the rest of our linebackers are kind of on the lighter side, so he could be someone that could play Sam and play Mike a little bit more often. So yeah, good question there. All right, Tennessee Tits says, who is the most overrated player on the team? Let's see. So we'll do overrated by Titans fans and overrated nationally. So let's start with national. So the national media isn't usually one to overrate Titans players, but let's actually just look at Madden ratings. Okay, so Madden ratings. Rashaan Evans, way overrated, especially considering that they have him higher than Jayon Brown. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Bradley McDougald at a 75. I don't know about that. The thing with Madden ratings is I think they rate everybody too high, but that's another discussion. Yeah, I'd say Rashaan Evans probably gets overrated by some because of the draft status and big splash plays at the goal line, that sort of thing. I think Rashaan Evans is the only person I would say from like a national scale. Overrated by Titans fans, there's really 3 that come to mind, and they're not even that overrated. But I think people overrate Anthony Firkser to an extent, or actually what I should say is that they underrate the importance of run blocking. As a receiver, he's good. He's accurately rated, I would say. But yeah, he just, like, it's not even that he's been a bad run blocker. They just don't use him as a run blocker, so he's a complete unknown in that regard. And, you know, to play like the true number 1 tight end role, you have to be able to run block. So Anthony Firkser, maybe a little bit. I think Jeffrey Simmons gets overrated in a way because he's a player with all the potential in the world to be an elite D lineman, but he hasn't reached that point yet. And I do think some fans have kind of gotten ahead of themselves as far as saying he's already broken out as this elite D lineman. But, you know, again, it's not like he's overrated. That's kind of a minor thing. And then the other guy I would say is David Long. I think Long is a nice player. He's athletic. He has really good instincts, but he's an awful tackler. I'll put the exact number on the screen, but he had the highest missed tackle percentage in the NFL last season, and he needs to improve a lot in pass coverage also. But overall, I would say Titans fans are pretty level-headed as far as evaluating the roster, at least the ones that I interact with. I'm sure there's like Facebook groups you could go to where every player is an all-pro, but you know, you get that with every fan base. Travis Walker says, do you think our defense can be 15th or better with what we have? Yeah, I'd say if the defense is worse than 23rd, I would be disappointed. And if it's better than 16th, I would be impressed. Wild Thing, when do you think Farley makes his leap to starting corner, if at all, this year? So these types of questions are tough to answer because I just have no way of knowing or predicting how a guy's going to develop. Like, I can evaluate a prospect and, you know, tell you what I think their strengths and weaknesses are, but once they get to the NFL, it's really just up to what their work ethic is like and what kind of coaching they get. And so my guess is really just as good as anyone's. I think taking a year off of playing is going to give someone a built-in adjustment period, but my expectation is that he would at least be able to beat out Chris Jackson on the depth chart. Cheek York asks, if present trends continue, lack of injuries, do you think Henry could rush for 2,000 yards again, especially now that Lewan is healthy, or will Julio take what would have been Henry carries? Yeah, I think Henry still has a good chance to hit 2,000 yards, especially with the extra regular season game. And I don't really see Julio eating into Henry's touches because you're losing the production from Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith, and Corey Davis almost had 1,000 yards, so Tennessee basically had 2,000-yard receivers, and Henry was still able to get 2,000. So, yeah, I mean, 2,000 yards is obviously a super rare thing, but I think he has as good of a chance of reaching that point as he did last season. Not exactly a mailbag question, but can you show some off-coverage stats from good defensive teams to let Titans fans know it's okay to run off-coverage sometimes situationally? Yeah, so there has been a bit of an overreaction to last season where a lot of people think there's no reason you should ever play off coverage. And there were a lot of times last season where they were giving way too much cushion, especially on third down. There were a lot of times where they just didn't have the speed at cornerback to be aggressive and play press. But there's also a lot of times where off coverage is just the right thing to play. And it has a lot to do with where you're vulnerable and what you're trying to take away based on your coverage. So if you don't have a lot of coverage help over the intermediate middle, you might press so that the receiver doesn't have a clean release for a slant route. But like quarters coverage, you usually see corners playing about 7 yards off the line of scrimmage. And a lot of the best defenses in the league play a lot of quarters with off coverage. That's the Rams, the Vikings, Colts. And if we look at the teams that played the most and least press man in 2019, there's really no correlation between off coverage and press coverage and, defensive success. So yeah, I mean, it's obviously Tennessee was, I would say, playing off coverage inappropriately a lot last year, but there's still plenty of uses for off coverage. Like there's a reason that defenses play it. Okay, so I'm going to answer these two questions together. John Burns says, did you have some kind of scouting profession or coaching background? And Will says, what made you want to get so in-depth in football? So I played football in middle school just because you had to play a sport every semester at my school, but my main sport that I played was basketball, and I didn't really take football seriously as a player. I started getting really into football from an X's and O's perspective in, I want to say, 2017. It was right around the point that people were starting to debate whether or not Mariota was the guy. And at the time, I couldn't really form a strong opinion on it because, like I've talked about, the broadcast angle doesn't show you what's happening down the field. So I didn't know if the receivers weren't getting open or if Mariota was reading the defense incorrectly or what. So I basically started watching film from all of the Titans games to try to figure that out. And I realized pretty quickly that there was a lot about football that I didn't know, even as someone who, I consider myself an educated sports fan, but I didn't know anything about run fits or coverages or any of that. So it's basically been a 5-year process of watching a play and then getting confused about something and then figuring out what was going on. And over time, I just sort of got to the point where I feel like I'm pretty knowledgeable about football. But the thing that keeps me passionate about it and keeps my interest level so high is that there's still so much that I don't know, and you can never really get to the point where you know everything about it. So, all right, Dime Soul says, how much of Raiden's struggles would you attribute to him switching from left tackle? Penei Sewell has also looked pretty bad after switching sides. Yeah, so for whatever reason, I've had it in my head this preseason that Raiden's played right tackle in college, but yeah, 100%. Switching sides at tackle can result in a huge learning curve. Pretty much every former offensive lineman that's like a pundit or commentator has made some analogy to like learning to write with the other hand or something like that. So yes, I would definitely attribute some of his early struggles to that for sure. JBT says, hey, do you think that our bigger wide receivers that haven't made for great receivers like McMath and Westbrook could have more successful career with the Titans if we converted them into tight ends? They have the size and toughness to be good blockers. So let's see. The average tight end in the NFL weighs 254 pounds, and Nick Westbrook weighs 215. I'm pretty sure Racey McMath weighs 220. And that extra 30 to 40 pounds is what makes those guys good or even just capable blockers. And it's important to keep in mind that wide receivers that people say are good blockers are blocking cornerbacks, whereas tight ends are blocking linebackers and edge rushers and even defensive linemen sometimes. Kyle Pitts, who's considered to be barely a tight end by a lot of people, he still weighs 240 pounds. So, yeah, I mean, I think that obviously they could put on weight, but when you talk about putting on weight, those guys are going to lose their explosiveness and their agility. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes you can make that conversion, but I don't know that it's something that you can just rely on to take failed receivers and convert them to tight ends. All right, last question from Kyle Jacob Wood. What are your thoughts on the third wide receiver? Is Reynolds still a lock with his injury concerns, or do you believe Chester Rogers or Marcus Johnson will step up and be that third guy? Yeah, if Reynolds is healthy, he's still the third receiver. It's hard to say with Johnson because reports from camp are obviously really good, but we haven't seen him play much. And I'd imagine that they'll rotate the bottom 3 or 4 guys if they play them at all. So yeah, thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoy my content and want to support the channel, make sure to check out my Patreon and subscribe over there.